Shock is a hugely influential game. It sits as one of the direct ancestors of the modern immersive sim, made when the team at Looking Glass Studios took ideas and mechanics that they'd initially explored in Ultima Underworld and recontextualized them in a space-bound cyberpunk horror story. Without System Shock, we don't have System Shock 2, and, potentially, no Thief, Deus Ex, Bioshock, Prey, Dishonored, and more. The game casts a long shadow, and is worth playing to get an idea about where those titles came from and where they trace their lineage back to. And it's worth playing in its own right as a tense, fairly open-ended game of a sort they, in a variety of ways, just don't make anymore. The problem is that to a lot of modern audiences, System Shock, as released in 1994, is kind of an incomprehensible mess. I mean, this is the screen that greets players upon starting a new game. And don't worry about memorizing everything, you can just hit Alt-O to bring it up later. Easy to remember. But keep in mind that's just the GUI explainer. Keyboard shortcuts can be seen on a different screen that's brought up by typing question mark. That's Shift//. And that isn't even the list of all keyboard shortcuts. Did you know that to reload in System Shock without using the mouse, you can hit Alt-Backspace? How do kids these days not get this? While there are obscure keyboard shortcuts for a lot of common actions, there's a reason the game opens with that big UX guide and not the keyboard inputs. The game is fundamentally built around using a mouse and keyboard. In System Shock, the cursor is your primary way of interacting with pretty much the whole game world, and your UI is your primary means of doing so. This is probably its biggest tie to Ultima Underworld as its predecessor, and one of the biggest differences between System Shock and its progeny. Keyboard shortcuts are for power users. The game is designed around a mouse and the accompanied screen-based UI. The cursor can be used for pretty much all interactions, up to and including base-level movement and looking around, though I wouldn't recommend it for obvious reasons. Aiming while moving becomes next to impossible, and it just feels like you're smearing your hand across the screen without haptic feedback, similar to the way that fake analog sticks in touchscreen games do. It's functional, but not pleasant. But this cursor and UI-based movement includes handling your posture and positioning. In System Shock, you have a virtual body that you're very aware of at all times. When you run out of stamina, what sort of drugs and stims are in your system, potentially giving you side effects, etc. And part of having a physical body includes how you're standing, crouching, or leaning. You can use the mouse to control almost all of those things via UI elements, up to and including looking up and down. And it's not just your pose that can be controlled through the mouse. Weapon selection, inventory management, listening to logs, opening doors, pushing buttons, solving electrical circuitry puzzles, aiming, shooting, reloading, healing. It's all done with the mouse cursor on the UI overlay or by clicking on things in the game world. This has a few impacts. One is verisimilitude. You really do control the game through your UI. You're given military-grade hacking implements per the game's intro, and the implication is that those implants are what let you do all the wild things you can do, from seeing in the dark to having targeting assistance to managing your inventory to hacking. The UI is just the manifestation of that cyber rig that the player can interact with. Indeed, elements of your UI actually unlock as you discover their corresponding modules in the game world, and are empty sockets until then. You're using a mouse and interacting with a computer terminal to interact with the game, the way the player character is interacting with a neural link to do the things they do on Citadel Station. It's not exactly a diegetic UI, but it's diegetic adjacent. Another impact is that it allows for richly configurable weapons. You can unload your firearm and put different sorts of ammunition in depending on what kind of enemy you're facing. You can even slide the power on your laser beam up and down, allowing you to do more damage by consuming more energy per shot, but generating way more heat in the process, forcing you to stop shooting sooner as the weapon cools. Or you can set it to overcharge for a single blast that instantly sends it to max heat for the most damage you can possibly do in a single shot. Weapons in System Shock feel like complex and configurable tools rather than a single mechanic thing like the shotgun or the rocket launcher. Finally, the mouse-based input gives System Shock some serious tension in the old-school survival horror sense. You aim and shoot with the mouse, but you also have to reload with the mouse, switch weapons with the mouse, heal with the mouse, and if you're not super comfortable with the keyboard inputs, you lean and move with the mouse. In the vein of Resident Evil's tank controls, the clunkiness prevents you from being an action hero and makes you vulnerable. It is terrifying to run out of ammo and have to stop aiming, open up your inventory if it isn't already open, and shuffle through to an appropriate weapon for the enemy type you're facing as their fire rains down on you. When you find yourself overwhelmed on a new floor and make a break for the elevator and have to simultaneously close the elevator door and then pick which floor you want to go to as you're taking damage, it's intense. Having the mouse cursor be your primary means of input means that you can only do one thing at a time, and in the heat of the moment, it can be hard to make sure you're making the right choices. But that same mouse-driven input system that makes the game so complex and so tense and so memorable also alienates the game from modern audiences. It's just not the sort of input system most people commonly associate with what otherwise presents itself as a first-person game. And this makes sense. It predates Mouselook. It predates WASD as a standardized movement system for inputs in first-person games. It predates dual analog stick controllers and big multi-platform releases. It predates Doom 2. In 2023, when we play first-person games, we like our heads-up displays to be minimal and our interactions to be focused on the center of our screen. Whether it's shooting, opening doors, pushing buttons, futzing with physics objects, or just trying to talk to people, the point of engagement is always dead center of the screen. System Shock's full-screen cursor just does not play with modern audiences, no matter what benefits it might have. And I mean, after the 100th time manually picking up each bit of ammo from a fallen robot, even I start to think there may be some valid point in doing things the new way. There was an attempt to remedy this by Night Dive Studios in 2015 with System Shock Enhanced Edition. This version let players toggle between a mouse-look approach that feels like a modern first-person game and a mode where the mouse is an on-screen cursor. The result is a bit of an awkward compromise. When you're navigating the world or engaging in combat, it's nice to have a traditional first-person input setup where the center of the screen is where you're aiming or looking. It makes the act of exploring the space itself far more user-friendly. You don't need to hold keyboard keys or fidget with a slider just to look up and down. You just flick the mouse up and boom, you're looking up. But when it comes to dealing with inventory, or your cybernetic implants, or looting fallen enemies, or even just reloading, assuming you're not willing to go the alt backspace route, it's back to a cursor-driven input mode. This results in making navigation and combat slightly less alien, but everything else is more or less the same. This makes it more approachable, but is really kind of an awkward compromise between the new world and the old. It's not really something that could be released on consoles, it's still too dependent on having the mouse there to navigate more or less the whole UI. But it provides enough shortcuts that modern first-person shooter players can feel more at home. Mouse wheel can swap weapons, for example, and that movement is mapped to the standard WASD instead of the Thief-style SZXC setup that uses A and D to turn left and right rather than strafe left and right. It also supports true HD widescreen resolutions and runs native in Windows. It's probably the best you can get in terms of a modern re-release of the original System Shock that keeps the game's strengths and its weaknesses, but is at least somewhat palatable to modern audiences. But we were still lacking a true modernization of System Shock, something that would try to genuinely bridge the gap between this really interesting game of old and the modern input systems and play sensibilities of today. And that brings us to Night Dive Studios' 2023 release of System Shock. And this game has been a long time coming. Announced in February of 2015, a few months before the release of System Shock Enhanced Edition, Night Dive Studios, then only 3 years old and with only a handful of old video game re-releases to their name, ran a Kickstarter to fund the project that reached $1.3 million. That sounds like a fair chunk of change, until you realize the game didn't release until 2023, meaning that even ignoring Kickstarter's cut, backer rewards, and taxes, the Kickstarter funds basically amounted to maybe $140K a year, which isn't nothing, but it's like, 1.5 programmers for the duration of the project. It was also rebooted multiple times, first when switching engines from Unity to Unreal and losing much of its original development team in the process, and later once delays and feature creep had pushed the game away from the original idea that it was simply a modern remastering of System Shock. It began approaching a full-on remake, abandoning the upsampled pixelated look of the Kickstarter demo and moving towards something a bit more generically high fidelity. It also began toying with adding new ImSim ideas like liquid nitrogen barrels that can slow or freeze enemies, which is cool, but it's nothing like System Shock. And after several false starts and dead ends and a host of angry Kickstarter backers, in 2020 Night Dive went back to the original vision for the title put forth in their Kickstarter pitch and spent 3 years polishing it. And now, finally, it's here, an attempt not just to re-release System Shock with some minor concessions to modernity like the Enhanced Edition, but a proper full remake of the game. And the driving vision behind it seems to be presenting System Shock not as it actually was, but as you remember it being. Wherever possible, the original vision of the game is embraced, but enhanced in minor ways that conform to a contemporary sensibility. And it's impressive how much the visual style of the game communicates this. Take the wall textures. They're actually 3D now, and greebled to heck in that late 80s, early 90s sci-fi style. But the texture is still low-res with hard-edged, chonky pixels when you get up close. The effect is one that mixes the aesthetics of early 90s lo-fi computer games and cheesy 80s spaceship movies with modern rendering techniques, lighting realistically cast shadows on normal mapped walls that can have reflection or wetness shaders, but that still feel like these archaic throwbacks. I mean, look at that font. It screams 1992 of the future. It's still undeniably System Shock, it's just reinterpreted through a modern lens. And you'll find that in the game's input systems too. The System Shock remake minimizes the necessity of a cursor, in part because it's aiming for a console release in the upcoming months. Puzzles and keypads have diegetic in-world inputs, and combat always shoots at the center of the screen. When you're using a controller, it still uses an analog stick-based cursor for the inventory, but really, having a dedicated take-all key solves most of the monotony there. So much better than dragging each item across the screen. The only annoying thing left, really, is having to vaporize each item for scrap individually. Anyways, combat has similarly been reworked in ways that feel more in line with standard first-person titles in 2023. Your body matters far less in the remake than it did in the original System Shock, something we'll talk more about in a minute, but surprisingly, leaning still factors pretty heavily into combat. The player is still a glass cannon, and it fosters an anxious, corners and edges approach to exploring new areas where scoping out a room or taking potshots at enemies is best done from behind cover. It's a game that encourages caution in its exploration because just trying to be an action hero gets you killed, especially on higher difficulties where enemies are more numerous and pack a greater punch. But there's no getting around the fact that modern first-person shooter inputs place pretty much every combat action at your fingertips in a way that System Shock definitely did not. What you gain in accessibility and convenience, you lose in tension. You no longer turn a corner with half a clip in your dart gun, fire 4 or 5 times at an enemy that surprised you until you hear the click of being out of ammo, and in a panic, use your left hand on the keyboard to awkwardly navigate back around the corner away from the cyborg ninja actively firing at you, while your right hand desperately tries to navigate the UI and bring up the weapons tab, click the reload button, and then confirm the right ammo before combat can begin again. Now you just release the lean right button and hit R to reload. You don't feel like a scared klutz grasping desperately for more ammo somewhere on your person, you feel like a badass FPS soldier doing the combat routine of a million other games. And I know it's very on brand of me to say this, but there's something lost with this removal of all the fidgety jank. Take the spark gun. The little dial in the original felt like you were futzing with an actual device. There was a very set phasers to kill vibe in choosing the big glowing overload button with the mouse. Like you had to actually reach to your weapon's config before then aiming and firing. And you had to turn the overload on each time you wanted to use it, and it could only be re-enabled once the heat meter was in the green again, which felt like a safety feature of the device, and being able to set the damage to its lowest setting to take out Shodan's cameras with almost no cost made it feel like a multi-use tool rather than just a gun. In the remake, all of those mechanics are maintained, but they're streamlined. Instead of a slider, you simply flick a switch between low, high, and overload, and once the gun is configured for overload, it stays in overload. It feels much more like selecting a firing mode in Call of Duty or something, and the settings and heat level of the laser are no longer in a GUI element on your military-grade cyber rig, but glowing lights on the Spark weapon itself. Which is fine. System Shock art director Evelyn Mansell has gone on the record about how the guns were supposed to be a little campy in their design, and it's a clever way to convey a lot of information while keeping to modern minimalist UI expectations. It totally works and is absolutely the right call, but all of these changes also make it such that the Spark no longer feels like a weird sci-fi tool. Instead, it feels like what it is, a first-person shooter gun with 3 firing modes. Keep in mind, I'm not saying any of this is bad, just different. Remember, System Shock is almost inaccessible to modern audiences, and this is definitely more accessible, pushing this weird exploration, resource management, role-playing action game towards more traditional shooter mechanics has been happening since at least BioShock. But there are trade-offs to modernizing a game like this. One of the other aspects of modernization is that it becomes hard not to view System Shock through the lens of its legacy. Immersive sims in general, but System Shock 2, BioShock, and Prey in particular. While most of the game keeps itself extremely loyal to the original System Shock, the remake does seem to take a few steps towards getting the game more in line with the titles that followed it. For example, they've added vending machines around the game world that sell ammo and, occasionally, weapon upgrades. To get credits to buy from the vending machines, you can pick up junk items in the game world and vaporize them into scrap. This scrap can then be taken to a recycling station that can convert it into credits, giving the game a resource to manage that it simply didn't have before.
Snacktron recommends has blue chips today.
This ties the remake in mechanically with the rest of the unofficial Shock lineage. Vending machines and weapon upgrades were introduced in System Shock 2 and have appeared in more or less every Shock game since.
Welcome to the circus of value.
And Prey even had a full-on recycling mechanic similar to what System Shock's remake has, where junk and other items can be turned into crafting resources. Now, you can make the argument that weapon upgrades aren't technically new. System Shock did have better versions of many of its weapons later in the game, and the intent was that you would simply replace the less good one with the better one, like finding a better sword in an RPG. But while it's mechanically similar, it feels different to just pick up the same gun with higher damage than using an upgrade station that consumes a resource to get specific perks for the weapon you already have. The remake feels much more of a piece with, say, BioShock's weapon upgrades. Specific stations that confer a choice of benefits. There's also a new intro sequence that feels much more in line with System Shock's direct descendants. The original game had an animated introduction that summarized the backstory before the hacker woke up on Citadel Station. Now, though, video game company credits roll across the screen in neon as a security drone flies through a cyberpunk metropolis on its way to observe the hacker commit the crime. It is very reminiscent of the city flyover in BioShock, or the extended helicopter sequence in Prey.
That's a nice view on the bay there.
Then we get a very brief interactive prologue in a mundane situation before the game proper starts, introducing you to the controls in an apartment before shattering that reality.
Turn around! Now!
Which is both a more modern way of introducing you to the mechanics rather than doing, well, this as soon as you start the game, but also it's very reminiscent of Prey.
Hey, Morgan, wake up. You're burning daylight. You sent the helicopter to pick you up. It's just a few tests. Don't forget to wear your suit. See you soon.
And this whole attempt to retrofit System Shock into its own legacy, into a more modern conception of an ImSim, is interesting to me, because part of the benefit of playing the original System Shock is to see where those ideas for later games came from to begin with, and how the genre evolved. It's not a bad choice to do this, per se, but it's certainly one that only makes sense here in 2023, as if one of the goals is to present a version of System Shock that not only is the version you remember, but one that slots nicely into the genre we've sort of assigned it in retrospect. Like, imagine remaking Kingsfield and adding aesthetic flourishes and game mechanics that would only really be established in Dark Souls in order to make it fit a little more neatly into the expected genre. It wouldn't be wrong to do so, but it also feels a little Ouroboros-y? Going back to the 2017 footage that showed the liquid nitrogen tanks and freezing mechanics, it's hard to escape the feeling that there was a no updates, no changes crowd at Night Dive, and a let's try to make it a proper ImSim this time crowd, and you can feel that tension a little bit even as the final game ultimately veers closer to the remake than the reimagining. And in an interview with NoClip, Night Dive CEO Stephen Kick seems to acknowledge that.
The people that we had brought onto the team at that point weren't really in love with the aesthetic that we had established in that original demo. And so that caused some initial rifts, and we had multiple prototypes of this System Shock game that all didn't really resemble one another. And they kept getting further and further away from that original Unity demo.
Perhaps one of the biggest changes is the way hacking in cyberspace works. As a cyberpunk game, System Shock took heavy influence from the works of authors like William Gibson, who envisioned cyberspace as a sort of computer file system meets acid trip, a psychedelic mind space that projected a computer network status into human sensory perception, resulting in something akin to a place that doesn't truly exist, a mapping of data and processes as shapes and colors. 1994's System Shock set out to capture this spaceless, bodiless notion of a mind experiencing a virtual world that was distinct from, well, the real-life virtual world that is Citadel Station. To do so, cyberspace is rendered in full 3D with flat-shaded polys and wireframes, unlike the texture-shaded space station. It controls a bit like Descent, in that there's no formal up or down. You can rotate yourself with 6 degrees of freedom. You're effectively a floating camera that can orient itself in any direction. And that is especially interesting when you remember that the body you're trapped in the non-cyberspace parts of the game is so lumbering, clunky, and physical. It's actually a really cool take on the contrast that Gibson tries to set up, given that it's done with 1994 level tech. Part of the backstory of Neuromancer's protagonist, Case, is that he gets attacked by some gangsters who give him a neurotoxin that may prevent him from ever experiencing cyberspace again. And the way the novel frames that experience being robbed from him makes it clear how much the escape from the physical was part of the appeal. For Case, who'd lived for the bodiless exaltation of cyberspace, it was the fall. In the bars he'd frequented as a cowboy hotshot, the elite stance involved a certain relaxed contempt for the flesh. The body was meat. Case fell into the prison of his own flesh. I'm not sure that the cyberspace in the original System Shock achieves what I would call bodiless exaltation, but the contrast does make you acutely aware of what it means to be trapped in a physical body, especially when you have to contort your body to crawl through vents, or lean around corners, or move in ways that make the camera sway like it's attached to a body with mass. So cyberspace, it's cool as an idea. But cyberspace is also one of the most confusing and least enjoyable parts of the game. The wireframe levels and limited draw distance make it so hard to figure out where to go, the game literally adds arrows to help guide you a lot of the time. The whole point of cyberspace adventures is to activate switches that open doors and do other things in the real world, but they're just random nodes floating in 3D space, and it can be easy to miss them, or easy to misread whether you've actually activated them. All the while, you're firing ice-breaking drills to bust through shields and shooting security program-destroying network pulses in an effort to defend yourself, because if you die in cyberspace, you take damage in meat space. And all of that takes place in a pre-descent 6 degrees of freedom minigame designed to be played with a cursor and optional key inputs instead of a joystick. Yeah, we're still doing the mouse thing. It is easily the thing that feels like it needs updating the most out of everything in System Shock. The new version loses a lot of that mind-body duality and cyber-psychedelia, but it works hard to make it a less obtuse exercise. Unlike the main game, where the differences in inputs between versions are complex and interesting, here I think hacking unambiguously benefits from making use of mouse look or dual analog sticks. It's still a 6 degrees of freedom shooting game that's confusing to navigate because the walls all have the same texture, but the goal in each area is now more explicit. Either destroy all the security to move on, activate nodes that will open up the next section of the map, or blow up giant glowing nodes that represent a security lock of some sort, thereby opening doors on Citadel Station. You will not get confused as to whether or not you've triggered these things. There's also no time limit anymore, and typically only one exit node at the end of all the rooms. As a series of arenas and switches, it's a lot more structured, linear, and almost guided. Consequently, it's also way more comprehensible. There's no ambiguity as to whether you've done something in the real world by accidentally bumping a switch node and not noticing, or taking an early exit before you've technically explored the whole thing. And the movement itself is just so much smoother. Losing the jank might have meant losing the sense of a physical body in Citadel Station, but it also means being a disembodied floating camera feels way more natural here. The System Shock Remake's hacking is no Descent or Overload, but for a glorified lockpicking minigame, it works so much better than the original. I think it serves as a good example of how systemic complexity and jank aren't always good things, how sometimes that stuff can build out a system's themes or texture or character, but other times they can get in the way of that system from doing what it was intended to do. And here, a floaty lockpicking minigame really does capture a sense of bodiless synesthesia way more than an approach that tries to be more literal about exploring a computer system with your mind. Finally, I think something should be said about the way the remake's increase in fidelity and reworking of the user interface has led to the main questline being more enjoyable without really changing it much at all. For example, the first real challenge in System Shock is shutting down Citadel Station's mining laser, as Shodan has it aimed at Earth and is preparing to fire.
Thank you. You have saved us all some effort by destroying the greater part of
Earth's civilization.
yourself.
But the game doesn't just point you at some singular big switch that needs flipping or some energy generator that needs shooting in order to stop it and let you go on your merry way. You find out what you have to do via the audio logs. And not even in some find the right log and it puts a marker on your map kind of way, but in an old school pen and paper way where the quests aren't formally listed out or marked, but implied. In the opening minutes of the game, Rebecca, your contact at Trioptimum, mentions the threat from the laser and that someone named Darcy is trying to stop it.
The mining laser is charging for a possible strike against Earth. There's a man named Nathan Darcy who may know something about taking the laser offline. His office is near the central hub on your level. The AI is on the bridge. Once the laser is out, look for the source of the problem there.
You find a log from Darcy later on that level that mentions the way to shut down the laser is by turning on the safety shield by using a sample of something called isotope X22, but because that would damage the laser, you'd also somehow need to override the safety mechanisms designed to prevent you from doing exactly that.
We can destroy the laser by firing it into the station's own shields. Isotope X22 is stored in the science level, and we need to bring it down to the reactor level to power the shields. Then you turn them on, use the safety override code to enable the laser, and fire. The laser controls and my notes are on the science level, and the override code's in the science library. I have no idea how you're going to do all this, but good luck.
Where is Isotope X22? What are these safety measures and how do you overcome them? That's for you to find out. Eventually you'll find the X22 in an irradiated room on level 2, if you can ignore the intense radiation noise long enough to find the subtle switch on the back wall that controls the shields. It's shockingly easy to miss. If you explore the library on level 2, you'll find a circuit that, when fixed, reveals the safety override code to the laser. And down on level R, the reactor level, you'll find an X22 receptacle that controls the shields and, in a different area, a laser safety override room with a code panel ready to take the safety override code from the library. It's up to you to put the pieces together, and all the while, as you're exploring, you're burning resources, many of which can't easily be replaced. By this point, the game has given you free reign throughout much of the space station, and you can run into these things in any order, or even spend a lot of time on floors 3, 4, and 5 that have little to do with the current objective, even if you don't know it yet. It is a game that it is extraordinarily easy to get stuck or lost in if you haven't played it before. And it would have been easy for Night Dive to add quest trackers, or navigation markers, or floating arrows that point you where you need to go. And in fairness, on the easier difficulty settings, they claim that they do, although I was never able to get them to actually appear for some reason. For the default and hard difficulty settings, though, they mostly just do some really clever and really subtle things to make the quests less arcane without spoon-feeding you information or leading you by the nose to each objective. For example, the station status is now carried with you, Before, you would just get periodic video emails when you reached certain milestones letting you know that a certain thing had been accomplished.
Radiation shields activated.
Showing you the status of Citadel Station gives you some strong hints about what needs to be accomplished, as well as what you have and haven't done yet. It's a punch card for the game's main beats. Have you disabled the laser yet? Have you jettisoned the grove with the virus? The computer section in the lower right even tells you what act of the game you're in based on what part of Shodan's plan you're disrupting, or what she's currently doing to try to stop it. This one minor change gives you a ton of context that's either implicit or simply missing in the original game. The remake also makes use of its higher fidelity. The signage on points of interest, for example, is way more clear, and interactive switches glow green or red and are harder to miss. Isotope X22, for example, is way easier to find when the button is a glowing green switch in the back of the room and not a collection of 9 pixels on a noisy texture. Additionally, every log is stored as both text and audio, meaning you don't have to manually re-listen to minutes and minutes of audio to find codes or critical mission info. And you also get the subject. In the original game, the notes were stored with just the crew member's name, so unless you remembered specifically that Darcy was the one who had the plan to shut down the laser, good luck finding the summary of what you need to do. Now there's an email titled Destroying the Laser, which, hey, that was what it was in the original, you just couldn't see it. All of this is just some signage and UI cleanup thanks to a higher screen resolution, but it's so helpful. None of these changes tell you where to go. None of them simplify the questline or remove steps. You still need to get Isotope X22 from level 2 down to the receptacle in level R, find the security override code on level 2, and enter it in the safety override terminal on level R before going back to level 2 to turn the laser on.
I see you are still alive, insect.
And you can still discover those things in any order or go spend time on the other floors that aren't related. System Shock is still an open-ended exploration-based adventure where it's totally possible to get lost or spend an inordinate amount of time in one area before remembering that you're supposed to be doing something on another part of the ship. But it no longer feels like a game that just generates that frustration naturally. It's no longer a game that resists being played by burying critical information in an audio file next to 30 other audio files, each named with a random character's name. You still have to piece together how to stop Shodan's plans, but the game no longer feels like it hides those pieces from you or makes them unfairly difficult to spot. Another example? Later in the game, there's a scene on the executive floor where a lot of individuals held out but didn't make it. And on the floor, amongst the bodies, there's the administration keycard. You might not know it's a keycard from the art, though, and it's just sitting there in a mass of bodies, and it's kind of easy to miss, or dismiss as debris from whatever happened here. But it's the only administrative keycard in the game. If you don't recognize it for what it is and pick it up, you're going to get stuck because the game needs you to have that card to open specific doors. In the remake, the room is a bunch of dead executives in suits at a dinner party, some of whom seemingly died at the table. There's a bit more environmental storytelling going on, with eaten junk food wrappers and one specific body next to a weapon, and in one corner there's a body that's huddled next to the keycard, which gives off a subtle video game item of importance sheen. But it's still off to the side, you still have to be exploring to find it, and it's still somewhat easy to miss. But glowing keycard that's clearly a keycard just feels less likely to be casually overlooked than thing that could be a potato chip bag, or book maybe, mixed in amongst the dead. In retrospect, I think the thing about System Shock that aged the most poorly isn't the input systems or the jank or even cyberspace. It's not even the if you give a mouse a cookie style quests themselves, because I think they're absolutely part of what makes the game so unique and memorable. They're arguably the heart of the game.
Jettison enable failure. Possible cause: damage to power relay. Consult diagnostic report in Repair Bay Level 3 for detailed analysis.
I love the way both System Shocks set you loose in an open but still constrained area with some vague, complex objective, and it's up to you to figure out how to get it done. There's some real adventure game or even escape room vibes to the way System Shock plays. No, the thing that aged worst about System Shock is the way it gave you these open-ended quests that span multiple objectives and levels in a game designed to chip away at your resources at every turn so exploration itself comes with a cost, and then telegraphed the clues, items, and places related to those quests so poorly. And I think more than anything else, addressing that without removing the escape room vibes themselves is what makes the remake stand apart from something like the Enhanced Edition, and that justifies whatever systemic nuances might be lost in some of the other changes that were made. The System Shock remake captures that sense of being set loose to discover the solutions to problems, only this time they feel actually solvable, without a guide or walkthrough or just 30 years of having played the original game so you've memorized what to do. And a game where players are given clues to find solutions to problems feels like the precursor to the modern immersive sims philosophy of letting players solve their problems their own way. You start to get a sense of how multi-level concurrent implicit goals slowly became single-level explicit goals as you traverse from System Shock to Deus Ex to Bioshock to Prey to Deathloop, and eventually the emphasis on player problem-solving moves away from high-level concepts and gets placed more and more on combat with emergent mechanics. How do I stop a space station's laser from firing becomes, how can I take out those two guards up ahead in a really cool way without anyone else noticing? Deathloop in particular is interesting because the minute-to-minute mechanics are all about expressive combat with lots of interlocking emergent mechanics, but the game itself is about discovering this scripted, bespoke way to take out all the necessary bosses in a single day, mixing the genre's low-level problem-solving present with its high-level problem-solving past. And in that sense, I do think the System Shock remake manages to help players new to the game, and to the whole legacy of immersive sims broadly, get a better handle on its history. It may have traded janky physical survival horror for sleeker action beats, but the overall scope of the project, its high-level game design, still manages to convey what makes System Shock such a unique title almost 30 years later.